Squawky. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Today, let's see, what are we going to talk about today? Oh, I guess we'll talk about South Africa, just to do something a little different. Anyway, we're going to start with some of the nation's history, and then we're going to begin with the earliest people that were here, and after that, we're going to visit Cape Town. That's our final port of call for this itinerary, so let's get started. South Africa is officially the Republic of South Africa. It's the 25th largest country in the world by land area. With 53 million people, it's also coincidentally the 25th most populous country in the world. South Africa is ranked as an upper middle income economy by the World Bank. And in terms of purchasing power, South Africa has the 7th highest per capita income in Africa. Sounds really good, doesn't it? But even with that, poverty and inequality remain widespread. About 1/4 of the people in the country are unemployed, and they live on less than $1.25 a day. South Africa has given us some of the oldest archaeological and human fossils ever found in the world. The oldest, Australopithecus africanus, has been nicknamed the southern ape. They walked upright, they had longer thighs and shorter arms than other primates. That made it more difficult for them to walk on their knuckles. Anyway, various hominid species existed here beginning about 3 million years ago, and that gave South Africa the nickname the cradle of humankind. Where they found all of those fossils are now World Heritage Sites from UNESCO. The southern ape was followed by various species, including Homo habilis. They were the ones who first made stone tools, and they were followed by Homo erectus and the Neanderthal. Most people think of the Neanderthal of having been way up in Europe, but they also were part of our line. And then along came the modern humans. They lived in South Africa for at least 170,000 years. There is evidence of several migrations of early tribes of people that came to South Africa beginning with really good evidence about 3000 BCE, so about 5,000 years ago or so. Then around the 4th century AD, the Bantu people arrived. Remember, we talked about Bantu a couple times before. They moved south from West Africa, probably driven because the West African area that they had come from was starting to experience severe dry climate and desertification and all that. Large communities of Iron Age farmers pretty soon settled in South Africa, and those farmers displaced or integrated with the earlier people who were already here. In 1460, Portuguese navigators were eager to find a sea route to India. They began mapping and exploring the South African coast as I talked about our discovery of the sea route to Asia. 20 years later, Bartolomeo Dias was the first European to travel around the southern tip of Africa. He named this place the Cape of Storms, probably because the weather wasn't real great when he got here in the southern hemisphere winter. Well, the King of Portugal felt that that was kind of a public relations nightmare, so he changed the name to the Cape of Good Hope because it represented the door to the riches of the East Indies. At the time of European contact, the most dominant ethnic group here in South Africa were the Bantu-speaking people. They began trading ivory, rhino horn, gold, shells, and slaves much earlier, long before the Portuguese got here. They traded those with the Arabs and the Phoenicians coming down from the Indian Ocean. Vasco da Gama was ordered by Portugal's king to expand on Dias's discoveries. He departed on an expedition with 2 ships, as you know, and they entered Table Bay at Cape Town simply because they had made a navigational error. They turned left a little too soon, so they ended up in the bay instead of going all the way around. But that made them the first Europeans to see Table Mountain, which they named because of its shape. When the Portuguese set foot in South Africa for the very first time, they encountered the Khoi natives. The Khoi have lived in South Africa since about the 5th century, and archaeological evidence shows that they came originally from Botswana. They had an animist religion tradition that even today gives special significance to the moon. The Dutch called them the Hottentots. Today that's considered to be a derogatory term, so Khoi is much better. and UNESCO has recognized the Khoikhoi culture. Da Gama gave the following description of the Khoikhoi in his diary, quote, "The inhabitants of this country are tawny-colored. Their food is confined to the flesh of seals, whales, gazelles, and the roots of herbs. They are dressed in skins and wear sheaths over their virile members. They are armed with poles of olive wood to which a horn browned in the fire is attached." End quote. The Portuguese traded tobacco, copper, and iron with the Khoikhoi in exchange for fresh meat. Well, everything was going along pretty good for a while, and then one of the Portuguese viceroys was killed in a skirmish with the natives, and the Portuguese ships started to bypass the mainland and never go back into the Cape again. They only stopped at the nearby Robben Island to get meat and water. By the late 16th century, Portuguese, French, and Danish ships were regularly anchored at Table Bay. They traded iron, copper, and among all things, marijuana with the local Khoikhoi people. Now in history, it doesn't say which way that trade was going. But I bet everybody was happy with the end result. Anyway, Sir Thomas Roe was an English diplomat in the mid-17th century who attempted to land deported British criminals at the Cape. It didn't work out really well because many of them were killed by the Khoikhoi or they drowned as their ships and boats capsized in the surf. Those who survived were taken back to England and the plan was abandoned. Transportation of criminals would commence again after Australia was finally going to be populated by the English. But several captains in the meantime from the Royal Navy laid formal claims to the shores of Table Bay in the name of the Crown of England. Well, King James I said, no, I don't want it, and he refused to annex the territory. The Netherlands' first contact with the South African coast occurred back in 1652. Cornelius de Houtman commanded a fleet of 4 Dutch ships for the VOC. VOC, or the Dutch East India Company, established what they called a refreshment station on Table Bay. Its purpose was primarily to provide fresh water, fruit, vegetables, and meat to ships that were en route to India. The Dutch also wanted to build a hospital there for sailors that got ill. They did have a small clinic that they ultimately built. They constructed a fort in Cape Town that was later replaced by what we know of today as the Castle of Good Hope. The Dutch East India Company hired a local named Harry. Not Harry like the prince, Harry with an E. Anyway, he was an interpreter and he was supposed to barter for cattle with the local Khoikhoi natives. All seemed to be going pretty well until Harry murdered one of the ranchers. Well, then he took off with nearly the entire herd of cattle. Well, the Dutch pursued him. They chased him all over, but they never were able to catch him. A little bit later on, Harry returned to Cape Town. Well, the Dutch, for some reason, nobody knows why, allowed him to stay there, and he was never punished for stealing that herd of cattle or killing the rancher. Not too much later, he and 20 of his followers moved out onto Robben Island, where they stayed on and off for about the next 8 years. While on the island, Harry assumed the duties or the role as the postmaster for passing ships. In another incident, Harry was sent to discuss trade with the Khoikhoi. He took all the barter goods from the Dutch and traded on his own account, not on the Dutch's account. He talked to them as though it was just his stuff. He returned back to the Dutch colony with 13 cattle, and that was all given to the East India Company. But Harry, being really an upstanding young man, took most of the goats, the sheep, and the cattle for himself. With the Dutch commissioners, they were pretty upset with him, and they felt the only practical way to deal with Harry and his followers was by territorial separation. The Dutch erected a series of fences to separate the natives from what had been their ancestral lands, but that land was now controlled by Dutch settlers. The natives were very restricted in their movement. They were forced to use designated gates to enter and leave the enclosed Dutch settlement. This was the very first incident of an official policy of segregation in South Africa. A series of armed confrontations over the ownership of the land took place between the Dutch settlers and the Khoikhoi. In the middle of the next century, the first Khoikhoi-Dutch War was fought. By 1684, the VOC had established price controls over things like hides and raw skins and ivory and ostrich eggs, probably even over some other things as well, maybe even marijuana. That provoked even more conflict with the indigenous population, and ultimately it brought about the creation of a black market for all of the items that they were taxing. In 1795, the very heavily taxed farmers, most of which were Dutch by that time, decided that they had enough with the Dutch East India Company, and they expelled the company and set up their own government. It was during that time that the Boers entered the picture. Now, Boer is a Dutch word for farmer. The term came to identify the descendants of Dutch-speaking settlers who came to South Africa. They included people who left the Cape Colony to settle in the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. Together, those states were known as the Boer Republics. The state name Orange came from the Protestant House of Orange, and that's up in the Netherlands. Now, they probably also picked that name because they saw the orange on the map. No, not really. The Boer primary motivation for leaving the Cape was to escape British rule. They wanted to distance themselves from the constant struggles and war that was going on between the British government and the local Khoikhoi natives. It turned out that the Boers themselves were hostile toward the indigenous African people. They saw themselves as being divinely ordained to rule the land and the backward natives that lived there. Eventually, the people, the Boers, as they moved around, became known as Trekboeren. That literally meant wandering farmer or dispersed ranchers. By the end of the 18th century, the cultural links between the Boers and their urban counterparts had basically disintegrated. They just didn't exist anymore. And both groups, though, still continued to speak Afrikaans. That language evolved partially from Dutch. It's a blend of Dutch and early native African. So it's kind of an interesting language to listen to, but a lot of people would have difficulty in understanding it unless you happen to be Afrikaans. Now enter the Zulu. The word Zulu means sky, and today they make up the majority of South Africa's population. Zulu is the most widely spoken language in the country. By the 19th century, the Zulu had formed a pretty powerful state. Their king, Shaka Zulu, united what was once an alliance of just tribes that just got along with each other into an impressive empire. The Zulus are a Bantu ethnic group. Traditionally, they recognize several essentials in human beings. So all of us have these essentials. There's the physical body, the thing that we're made of. The breath, which they considered to be the life force. And the shadow. Your shadow is your personality. Today, they also believe in a creator God who, among other things, is above interfering or meddling in day-to-day human affairs. So the God just kind of looks down and says, look at those people down there doing what they do. Anyway, in order to appeal to the spirit world, a Zulu diviner or shaman must first invoke their ancestors to determine what the real problem is. The Zulu originally thought that ancestor spirits had the power to intervene in people's lives. That could be either for good or for evil. As such, the shaman, the diviners, and the herbalists play a very important role in the daily lives of Zulu people, and they have for centuries. Herbalists prepare a mixture of stuff that's called muti. It's consumed in order to influence the ancestors. Okay, the distinction is made between white muti, which has very positive effects, such as healing things or preventing or reversing misfortune, and black muti. Now, black muti can bring on illness or the death to somebody else or ill-gotten wealth to the users. So I guess that would be kind of occult. Anyway, the people that use black muti are looked upon as witches within the Zulu society, and they are generally shunned across the whole nation. In the mid to late 1800s, One of the things that really helped this country, diamonds and gold were discovered in South Africa. That brought about a flood of immigrants that were followed not too soon after that with a thing called the Mineral Revolution. The British and the Boers defeated the natives in the Zulu War, but there was a struggle to control the precious resources, and that impacted the relations between the Europeans and the indigenous population. So the little skirmishes and struggles continued. Ultimately, Britain defeated the Boers and they formed the Union of South Africa. It included the territories, earlier territories of the Cape and the Natal colonies, as well as the republics of Orange, the Free State, and the Transvaal. Cape Town became the capital of the new Union and later capital of the Republic of South Africa. The Land Act of 1913 prevented blacks from purchasing land, and that was at a time when the natives controlled by ownership only about 7% of the country. The Boer Revolt, or the 5 Shilling Rebellion, occurred in South Africa at the beginning of World War I. The old Boer republics didn't want to side with England against Germany so soon after they had just had a long, bloody war with the British. So they said, no, we don't want to do that, and they rebelled. That rebellion didn't last very long. It was put down by Louis Botha and Jan Smuts. The rebel leaders received heavy fines and terms of imprisonment. 20 years later, the National Party of South Africa sought recognition and reconciliation between the Afrikaners and the English-speaking whites. That particular group legally established segregation that we know today and knew in the past as apartheid. Apartheid led to the Group Areas Act that classified all areas according to race. Former multiracial suburbs of Cape Town were either purged of unlawful residents or simply demolished. A white minority continued to control the vastly larger black majority. The white minority enjoyed the highest standard of living in all of Africa. The black majority remained very much disadvantaged by almost every standard in the world. Cape Town was home to many leaders of the anti-apartheid movement, including Mahatma Gandhi, who had moved down here as a lawyer from India as he began his legal career. Despite strong opposition from within and outside the country, the government continued to authorize the continuation of apartheid. They harshly oppressed resistance movements, and violence became pretty widespread. Some Western nations and institutions began to boycott businesses with South Africa because of the racial policies and the opposition to civil rights. Among other things, they banned the trading of the Cougarand, the gold coins that used to be very popular in the West, and they were also a very big source of money for South Africa. International sanctions and divestment of holdings by large international investors and companies accompanied growing unrest and oppression within South Africa. In 1956, the armed wing of the African National Congress was known as the Spear of the Nation. It was led by a young Nelson Mandela, who initiated a program of civil disobedience. Mandela coordinated a campaign against military and government targets. Increasing repression and violence from the government. The state was actually causing a lot of the violence themselves, and that convinced Mandela that many years of nonviolent protest had achieved nothing, and that would never succeed. Mandela made plans for a possible guerrilla war if disruption failed to end apartheid. Anti-apartheid activists employed things like strikes, marches, protest, and even some sabotage by bombings. And this was really a long-term thing that went on for years and years. Many of us in the West didn't even hear about it because it didn't make the front page in our papers. Anyway, because of his activity, Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life in prison and sent to Robben Island. That island's about 10 kilometers or 6 miles from Cape Town. And I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk about the history of Robben Island, and then we'll come back and talk some more about South Africa. Early settlers to the area released rabbits out on the island, and that was to provide I guess you'd call it a steady and regular source of meat for passing ships. I guess because the bunnies would tend to make more bunnies. Anyway, when the Dutch arrived into the area in the mid-1600s, the only large animals on the island to speak of were seals and birds, and the birds were principally penguins. The African penguin, also known as the jackass penguin, now we saw them in Namibia. We talked about them in Namibia as well. And as you recall, their name comes from its donkey-like bray that can be heard during breeding. These little birds have a very distinctive, you can actually see it better in this picture, distinctive pink patches that's just above their eyes. It's a little like a skin tab, and above their black facial mask. That pink is actually a gland that helps the bird adjust for changing temperatures. When it starts to get too warm, the bird's body sends more blood to these glands to be cooled by the outside air. When that happens, that patch will get darker and darker shade of pink, and when it's really warm, it becomes almost red. The African penguins are monogamous, and for the most part, they mate for life. It breeds in colonies, and pairs return to the same breeding site year after year. Today, there are 2 sites that are visited by these penguins that are both near Cape Town. It was possible simply because in this area, there had been essentially no predators left. The natives and the settlers had all gotten rid of the predators. The colony out on Robben Island was exterminated after about 1800, and then 183 years later, some of the penguins, probably those that didn't come from on shore, reestablished the colony out on the island. And today there's about 13,000 or so birds who call Robben Island their home. When we were in Cape Town, was it last year? No, when we went out to the colony. I think it was last year. We went out to the penguin colony that's on the mainland. And it's really interesting because you can get really close to these birds. You're on a walkway and everything, but it's really interesting to watch their behavior because the males will kind of protect their female partner. And we saw one couple that was mating at the time we got there, and then when they got done, the male kind of walked over and stood next to the female, and he reached out with his little flipper, and he put it on her shoulder, just kind of saying, well, thank you very much, can I have a cigarette or something? I don't know. But anyway, it was really interesting to watch because then that little male would bray every time another male even came close to that female. Robben Island is also a place where there's a sacred site for Muslim pilgrimages. They built a shrine out there, a little mosque, to commemorate one of Cape Town's first imams. He was exiled to the island in the mid-1700s and even died out there. Robben Island and the nearby Whale Rock, which you can't see, and you can see Robben Island, but you can't see Whale Rock because it's off to the right, have been the nemesis for many ships and crews. In fact, the surf thunders continuously around here when there's any kind of waves, and vessels that get wrecked on the reefs offshore basically get beaten into small pieces very quickly and just disappear. There was a Dutch ship that was laden with gold coins, and it was supposed to be coming into town to make a payment for the salaries of the employees of the VOC. It hit the rocks and it disintegrated on the reef. That gold today has not been recovered, and it could be worth tens of millions of dollars. Well, we have a night in Cape Town. Anybody want to go out and dive with me, and we'll see if we can come back with a few gold coins? Look at them. Just because there's great white sharks and other things in the water, I mean, why not? Anyway, it might be fun. Since the end of the 17th century, Robben Island was mainly used for isolation of political prisoners. They also had a leper colony out there, and it was used as an animal quarantine station. Today, there are tours of the island and the prison. They're led by guides who sometimes, not always, but sometimes they're former inmates from the prison. And of course, as time goes on, fewer and fewer of those inmates are still surviving, so the numbers are dropping. Anyway, UNESCO has named Robben Island as a World Heritage Site. It's a very interesting place to visit, not at all like Alcatraz. Now, back to our story about South Africa. In 1990, the state or country's president, F.W. de Klerk, announced the first steps towards dismantling apartheid. He lifted the ban on the African National Congress. Nelson Mandela was released from prison after 27 years. That 27 years, by the way, was spent mostly in isolation. Mandela made his first public speech from the balcony of Cape Town City Hall, and that occurred just hours after he was set free. The address heralded the beginning of a new era for South Africa. De Klerk negotiated with Mandela for a transition of policies and government. In a referendum, 2/3 of the white people, the white electorate in South Africa, voted in favor of dismantling apartheid, and that was to be done through negotiation. The far-right Afrikaner resistance movement, they called themselves the AWB, tried unsuccessfully to derail those negotiations by using acts of public violence and intimidation, but that group was pretty much suppressed by the authorities. Nelson Mandela was subsequently elected as president of South Africa in 1994. He formed a government of national unity. The parliament in the country enacted a new constitution and a Bill of Rights 2 years later. Still, from time to time, there are some small uprisings. In early 2002, there was a planned military coup by a white supremacist movement that was known as the Boer Force. That was foiled by South African police. 24 conspirators were arrested, and the extremist organization was pretty quickly dismantled. Those conspirators included senior South African military officers. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up, and it was headed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And its purpose was to expose crimes committed during the apartheid era. The commission allowed victims to tell their stories and perpetrators to confess their guilt. Amnesty was offered to anyone who made a full confession. Those who chose not to attend or not to appear before the commission were then required to appear to face criminal prosecution if the authorities could prove their guilt. The commission heard many stories of brutality and injustice, not just from the black community, but from the white community, actually from all sides. This commission heard just how violent South Africa had been. Some soldiers, police, and ordinary citizens confessed their crimes, but very few of those who had given the orders or commanded the police presented themselves to the commission, and it proved very difficult to gather any evidence against those that were alleged for higher crimes. The alleged criminals included de Klerk, Mandela, and many other very prominent people in South Africa. In 2008, competition for jobs, business opportunities, public services, and housing led to some tension between refugees who had flooded into the country because now it was more of an open country, and the host community's people. Riots in Cape Town left over 60 people dead. Over 100,000 people were driven from their homes. The targets were mainly migrants and refugees who had come here seeking asylum. But a third of the victims, unfortunately, were also South African citizens. That was back 8 years ago. So things have quieted down quite a bit, and calm has prevailed across South Africa most recently. Cape Town is located at the same latitude as Sydney, Australia, and Buenos Aires. To give you an idea, to put it in perspective, it is as far south of the equator as Casablanca and Los Angeles are north of the equator. Cape Town as a region has a very Mediterranean climate, a very extensive coastline, rugged mountain ranges, and inland valleys. It's really kind of a neat place. Has a lot in common with Southern California. The area in and around Cape Town is about as pleasant as anyone could want. It's beautiful here. I think you all will enjoy Cape Town. Cape Town itself is a beautiful city that is mostly located on an area called the Cape Flats. Geologically, the flats are a rising marine plain that consists mostly of sand. It's old seafloor that's slowly moving up. That is, did I go too far? Nope. That plain is a proof that at one point in time, long ago, maybe a million years or so ago, Table Mountain was an island. Table Mountain has a near vertical cliffs basically on the face that you look at from the ocean, and a very flat top on the summit. It's about 1,000 meters high, or some 3,300 feet. There's a thin strip of cloud that's very common that shows up on the top of that mountain, and locally they call it the tablecloth. If you have luck like I have, when I go up on Table Mountain, the tablecloth gets really intense. So you kind of have to be a little bit lucky, but when you get up there, the views are spectacular, and sometimes the tablecloth's there, sometimes not. But it often forms up on top of the mountain. The mountain encloses a central area of Cape Town that's known as the City Bowl. There are an estimated 2,200 species of plants on the top of Table Mountain alone. To put that into perspective, that's more than exists in the whole United Kingdom. The earliest known human habitation in the region was found at Pier's Cave in Fishhook. That dates to about 15,000, maybe 12,000 years ago. They didn't leave much behind, just some evidence that humans were there, and very little is known about the residents. Then, for thousands of years, Cape Town was inhabited by a group of people called the Strandloper people, and they were ancestors, descendants from the Kalahari Bushmen. So they kind of disappeared over time. Strandloper basically translates as beachcomber. Located on the shores of Table Bay, Cape Town itself was built by the Dutch East India Company simply as a supply station, as I said earlier. And that worked pretty much for their ships sailing to East Africa. They were also going to India and the Far East. Jan van Riebeeck arrived in 1652 on one of those ships, and he established the very first permanent European settlement in South Africa. Cape Town became an economic and cultural hub of the colony, but it quickly outgrew its original purpose as the first European outpost. Until the gold rush in Johannesburg, Cape Town was the largest city in South Africa. Of course, when the gold rush hit, everybody moved to Johannesburg, and they also moved the capital there. And then they moved the capital again. Anyway, the Castle of Good Hope, built before 1679, is South Africa's oldest surviving structure. The locals simply just call it the castle, so if you want to go there and you get in a cab, just say you want to go to the castle, and he knows right where to take you. The Dutch needed it for maritime replenishment station, and originally the waterfront was right up near the face of this fortress. But it served also as a center of civilian administration and military life at the Cape until the settlement started to grow. Today, the castle is the seat of the military of the Cape and houses a military museum. Has extensive displays of historical military paraphernalia, has a history of the castle, has an art collection, and there's also quite a bit of old Dutch colony furniture from Cape Dutch buildings. Cape Town is noted for its architectural heritage and probably has the highest density of Cape Dutch style buildings in the world. Cape Dutch style basically combines the architectural traditions of the Netherlands, Germany, France, and Indonesia. And you can see it in the old government buildings in the central business district, up along Long Street in the center of the city. Cape Town's waterfront is a major attraction, and like Sydney, Australia, the adjacent coastal area contains a mix of kind of funky, I guess you'd call them funky, upscale beach and surfing suburbs. They're kind of interesting places to go. If you have time to enjoy a little time in a beach community, they're a lot of fun. And like San Francisco, it provides easy access to the nation's prime wine regions. They do have pretty decent wine in South Africa. They have great wine, as a matter of fact. Anyway, like both of those cities, Cape Town has its own unique urban attractions and landmarks. So it kind of blends what you would experience in Sydney or what you would experience in San Francisco. Cape Town area has some of the world's best wine-producing vineyards. Stellenbosch is the second oldest European settlement in the province after Cape Town itself. The town became known as the City of Oaks because of the large number of oak trees that were planted by the founder of the city. Stellenbosch is the primary location for viniculture within the city, and it's also where they do a lot of vinicultural research. The South African wine industry produces about 1 billion liters of wine a year. That's probably more than any of us could drink in a year. Maybe not. Anyway, the wine regions of Stellenbosch and Franschhoek and Paarl are all within about an hour's drive of the city. and there are some 250 wine farms or vineyards within a 30-minute drive of the center of Stellenbosch. What a great way to end a wonderful cruise from Bridgetown to Cape Town. We visited 10 countries and 14 ports of call. We essentially followed the route that was taken by the early Portuguese explorers as they were working through the Atlantic looking for a sea route to Asia. Now, for those of you that are on the world cruise, Susie and I will be staying on just until Kenya. And then we will be back again later on. I'll talk about that in a minute. But when we're here in Cape Town, you're going to get a whole new gaggle of speakers. There's going to be three new speakers that are coming on. I have one more presentation that I'll give you after we leave Cape Town, and that's on the formation of a new continent. And that's actually forming as we speak. So it'll something to look forward to. Since this is my last presentation for this itinerary, I'd like to thank Alex and Terry back in the booth and Jason, our broadcast manager, for their help in making all these presentations work. Thanks, guys. And I'd like to also give a big thank you to the rest of my team. So could I roll the credits, please?